Welcome to the database lesson, where we create our SQLite database. Now here I have open the DB browser for SQLite. This is a really great tool for very easily creating our databases. Now if you aren't familiar with this or you want a little more information, I do have a video on YouTube that probably should have led you to this course. It's really the introduction to SQLite for C#. And in there, we actually get the DB browser for SQLite. But if you wanted to get it directly, you go to help about. It says go to SQLitebrowser.org. Now, don't forget that SQLite, it's not SQLite, it's SQLite. So SQLitebrowser.org is where you go in order to get this DB browser for SQLite. Okay, very easy install. Once you have it installed, you can create your own SQLite databases. So what I'm going to do is copy this path here. This is where we're going to save our SQLite database to start. And I'll say create new database. I'll paste that path in. And we're going to call this the bill time app DB. Okay, so we'll call it the bill time app DB, since this will be for the build time application. And maybe actually, you know what? Let's leave off the app. So it's just a build time DB. Since we call the application itself, we're going to call it build time. So this is the build time DB. We can use any of these extensions if you wanted to. I'm going to leave it blank and let it create its own, which is just the db.db extension, which is fine. And now we have our SQLite database. So that's the buildtimedb.db. And now we start creating our database. So let's start with our client table. And we'll add a field. And the field one is going to be ID. We'll make it not nullable, primary key, auto incrementing, and unique. Okay, so that's just going to be our primary key, which is going to be a number that starts at 1 and just kind of auto increments from there. So 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, next we're going to have the name. That's the client name. And we'll make this into a text field. And we're going to say that this is not nullable. We'll add another field. Hour rate. Let's call it hourly rate. And that will be a numeric field. Actually, let's make that real. So the difference here is numeric and real, they both will hold a decimal number. It's just that the numeric holds a decimal type versus real, which holds more of a what we'd equate to in SQL or C# actually as a double. So we're going to use real for our hourly rate. And that also is not nullable. So you're going to have to give us a hourly rate. Okay, next is the email address for the customer, or the client, sorry. Email, and that's going to be a text field, also not nullable. We have to know how to email them to contact them. Now, obviously, we could have a lot more information here. We could have their address, their phone number, their fax number. I mean, there's lots of stuff here. I'm just saying, you know what? We're just going to ask for their email address, and that's it, because that's how we're going to contact them. By doing the design this way, we can, if we want to, add more tables later that have more details about the client's contact information. Okay, was linked by the client ID, and then say, okay, this is their address, because a client can have more than one. So that's great. We'll already be set up to link out, so we can just say, here's the 5 addresses that the client has. All right, so next we're going to have pre-bill. And this will be of type integer. Okay? And we're not going to have this be nullable. We could set a default here to be either pre-bill or not pre-bill, but I'm not sure that there's a clear winner here as to what people will do. Maybe, not pre-billing would be a better option, or more common option, I guess you could say. And so therefore we'll leave it at 0. Now this is technically a Boolean field, but we're using an integer data type because we have a lot less data types in the SQLite database. Okay, pre-bill. Next we have has cutoff. And this also would be an integer, and we're not going to make it nullable. But we'll say here that we don't typically cut customers off. We let them, keep spending their money, essentially. So we'll leave that at 0. And then this next one, instead of has cutoff, we're going to say the cutoff happen, so you never cut a person off if it was 0. So therefore, that's a safe one to have as a default, and it allows us to make it not nullable. Okay, after cutoff, we have minimum hours. So this is the minimum we bill them for. So if we do a job that's 30 minutes long, do we bill them for 30 minutes, or do we bill them for 2-hour minimum? This one we should probably make into a real, because of the fact that maybe your minimum hours is 1.5 or 1.75, something like that. So again, not nullable, but the default will again be 0, because that's not necessarily something that everyone does. Next, we have our billing increments. And this will be in hours, so therefore we need to have that be a real, so that we can have things like 0.25 for 15-minute increments. As far as a default here, I don't want to put 0 for a default. I could put 0.25 for the increments, because that's a pretty common one. And I think I'm going to do that. These are all subjective choices. If you say, you know what, everyone in my industry bills at half-hour increments, then by all means change that. But from what I see from the people I talk to, quarter-hour increments is a pretty standard one. All right, and round up after X minutes. That's a rather wordy one, but at the same time, that's, I think, pretty clear as to what it means. So X would be this value, whatever the value is, which it'll be an integer because we're talking minutes. And so we're saying round up after, and I'm going to put that default to 0, because normally we round up right away. So if you cross that threshold, 1 second, really. Now, we're pretty generous there. At least I am, where, I don't do that. But, for this program's sake, we have to give it some kind of cutoff. And so I would say that I round up after 0 minutes. Immediately, once we get into the next 15 minutes, you're getting billed for that 15 minutes. is that the right name? Those kind of things. All right. So now let's create our defaults. And we'll add our field ID. It's all the above. And we'll add our next field, which is hourly rate. And this is I believe it's a real. And in fact, you know what? I'll come back and look at that later just to make sure that we're matching those up. It should be a real for our hourly rate, just in case you have a, 50 cents, so $10.50 an hour. Typically you don't, but just in case. I don't have a default for that. Pre-bill, that's an integer. I'm going to make it not nullable. And the default is going to be no, we don't pre-bill. The cutoff. We'll add our next field. I'm not sure why that's still editable. But our next field is going to be round up after X minutes. And that's going to be an integer since it's minutes. And we'll say that the default is 0. So these are defaults for for ourselves. Okay, so this is, when we add a customer, we're going to have all these defaults in place. We hit OK. Now I did want to look at the clients and look at the hourly rate, which is a real. Excellent. Just to be sure. All right, so now that takes care of our first two tables. Let's create our third table, which is payments. And the first one is ID. It's a type integer with all the bells and whistles. And now we have client ID, which also is an integer and also is not optional. So it's not nullable. And after that, we have our hours, which can be partial hours. So therefore, we'll make sure that's a real and it's not nullable. And the next is the amount, also a real and not nullable. And finally, the date. So we'll use real. So the date here, we don't want not nullable. And the default, we're going to wrap this whole thing in parens. And we'll say date, time, new parens, single quote, now, end single quote, comma, single quote, local time. end single quote, and then close out our 2 parens. Okay? So what that'll do is it will create for us the date timestamp of now, and it will be in local time. Hit OK. And then our last table will be the work table. ID, all the bells and whistles. Next is our client ID. That's not nullable. Notice I'm not putting defaults here, and I don't think I put any defaults except for the date in the last table. That's because we don't have defaults for these, and that's okay. Hours. This will be a real, and it's not nullable. Again, no default. Title. This will be a type text. And not nullable. Next we'll have description. And it will also be of type text. Coming at not nullable, but the default will be an empty string. We're going to have the date. Date entered. Let's call it that. Make that a real. Not nullable. And set the default to open paren, date time, open paren, single quote, now, single quote, comma, single quote, local time, single quote, and both of our parens. Okay, we're going to add a field. We're going to call this the, paid. It's an integer. By default, it's 0. This will be a Boolean, essentially. And then our last one is payment ID, also an integer. We're going to make this nullable because if this has not been paid for, then there is no payment ID. So we're going to close this out, and yes, we're going to save the changes we made. And now we're done. Now it's 40 kilobytes. Now we can copy this file around and use it wherever we need to. And in fact, I'm going to copy this file, and it will go with every deployment of our application. Because it's blank, it's a clean slate for any new application that uses it. Now, before you move on, make sure that you have created your own database and filled it in completely so that you're ready for the next lesson. Always make sure you're doing this along with me. Okay? So once you've done that, then you can move on to the next lesson.